The crowd's hushed whispers sliced through the stuffy air of Pearson's auction house like a knife, but none of them cut as deeply as the shame burning through Fiona Parker's chest as she stood trembling on the makeshift wooden platform. The year was 1876, and Westcliffe, Colorado, a mining town nestled in the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, had seen its share of desperate times, but never had it witnessed the daughter of one of its founding families being auctioned off like cattle to pay her deceased father's debts. $500 for the hand of Miss Parker. Do I hear 6? Harold Pearson's voice boomed across the room packed with miners, merchants, and ranchers, all eyeing the slender young woman whose once fine blue dress hung loosely on her frame after weeks of worry and meager meals. Fiona's gaze remained fixed on the scuffed floorboards beneath her feet. 22 years old and raised to be a lady, she'd never imagined this fate. Not even after her father's unexpected death 3 months prior, when she discovered his mountain of debts and the mortgage on their family home held by the ruthless banker, Vernon Stiles. 600, called a gruff voice from the back of the room. Fiona recognized it as belonging to Thaddeus Murphy, the 60-year-old owner of the largest silver mine in the county. She shuddered involuntarily. His 3 previous wives had all died under mysterious circumstances, and the thought of becoming the 4th made her stomach churn. 700. This time it was Edgar Fleming, the saloon owner whose breath perpetually reeked of whiskey and whose hands wandered where they shouldn't whenever she'd been forced to deliver laundry to his establishment these past desperate weeks. $800. The new voice cut through the room like thunder across the plains, causing every head to turn toward the entrance. Silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun stood a tall figure, his face shadowed by the brim of a well-worn Stetson. As he stepped forward, Fiona caught her first glimpse of him, a man perhaps 30 years of age, with broad shoulders that strained against a simple but clean cotton shirt. His face was tanned and weathered from years under the sun, with a strong jaw partially covered by a neatly trimmed beard the color of sun-bleached wheat. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, clear blue like a mountain lake, and currently fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. 900, Murphy countered, his voice thick with irritation. $1,000. The stranger's tone remained steady as he moved further into the room, revealing the gun belt slung low on his hips and the silver star pinned to his leather vest. A lawman, then, though not one Fiona recognized. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. $1,000 was more than most men in Westcliffe earned in a year, going once. Pearson's voice quavered with excitement at the unprecedented sum. Going twice. $2,000. The stranger's declaration silenced the room instantly. Sold. Pearson stammered, bringing down his gavel with a crack that sealed Fiona's fate. To the gentleman with the badge. As the stranger approached the platform, Fiona finally spotted the words engraved on his star. U.S. Marshal. He removed his hat, revealing thick sandy hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and extended a calloused hand to help her down. Marshal Brody O'Connor, madam, he introduced himself quietly. If you'll come with me. Uncertain but with no alternative, Fiona placed her trembling hand in his and allowed him to guide her through the parting crowd toward the exit. The eyes of the townspeople followed their progress, some curious, others disappointed, a few openly hostile. Outside in the blinding Colorado sunlight, the marshal led her to a hitching post where a magnificent chestnut gelding waited patiently. Rather than helping her mount, however, he released her hand and stepped back respectfully. "Miss Parker," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "I want you to understand something. I didn't buy you today." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded document which he handed to her. "I bought your father's debts. They're paid in full now." Fiona unfolded the paper with numb fingers. It was indeed a receipt for the full amount owed to Vernon Styles Bank, stamped paid in bold red letters. "I don't understand," she whispered, looking up at him in confusion. "Why would you do this?" The marshal shifted uncomfortably. "Your father once did me a great service. I'm simply repaying an old debt." He gestured toward the town's main street. "You're free to go home now, Miss Parker. Your house is yours again." Tears welled in Fiona's eyes as the full impact of his words sank in. "But $2,000. I could never hope to repay such a sum." Marshal O'Connor shook his head firmly. "I don't expect repayment, madam. Consider the debt between our families settled." He replaced his hat and turned back to his horse. "Wait," Fiona called, suddenly desperate not to let this mysterious benefactor disappear. "At least let me offer you a meal. It's the very least I can do." The marshal paused, one foot in the stirrup, and seemed to consider her offer. After a moment he nodded. "That's very kind, Miss Parker. Perhaps tomorrow evening. I have business to attend to first." "Tomorrow evening would be fine," she agreed, her mind already racing ahead to what she could prepare with her limited supplies. As he mounted his horse, Fiona found her voice again. "Marshal, the debt my father owed you. May I ask what service he provided?" Brody O'Connor looked down at her, and for an instant, something like pain flickered across his features. "He saved my life, Miss Parker, 7 years ago. Now I've returned the favor." With a tip of his hat, he nudged his horse forward, leaving Fiona standing in the dusty street, clutching her freedom in the form of a receipted bill, and watching her mysterious savior ride away. Fiona's legs trembled as she made the walk home, the weight of what had nearly happened pressing down on her. The Parker family home stood at the edge of Westcliffe, a modest 2-story structure that had once been filled with laughter when her mother was alive, and her father's mining investments were paying dividends. Now it stood silent, a hollow reminder of happier days. Inside, she leaned against the closed door and finally allowed herself to cry tears of relief, confusion, and lingering fear. When the storm of emotion passed, she straightened her shoulders. Tomorrow evening, Marshal O'Connor would come to dinner, and she would at least have answers to the questions swirling in her mind. The following morning found Fiona at the general store, counting out precious pennies for flour, coffee, and a small cut of beef. The storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Abernathy, eyed her with undisguised curiosity. "Heard about what happened at the auction yesterday," the older woman said, measuring coffee beans into a paper sack. "That new Marshal sure caused quite a stir." "New Marshal?" Fiona inquired, trying to sound casual. "Just arrived 2 days ago. Taking over for old Marshal Givens, who retired last month." Mrs. Abernathy leaned forward conspiratorially. "They say he's made quite a name for himself cleaning up mining towns further north. Real serious type from what I hear." Fiona nodded thoughtfully. "Do you know anything else about him?" "Just that he keeps to himself. Rented a room above the telegraph office." Mrs. Abernathy's eyes twinkled. "Handsome devil, though, isn't he? If I were 30 years younger." Fiona felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Thank you for the supplies, Mrs. Abernathy," she said hastily, gathering her purchases. As she turned to leave, the storekeeper's wife called after her. "Oh, and Miss Parker, the whole town's talking about how he set you free instead of. Well, you know, not many men would do that." No, Fiona thought as she stepped back into the sunlight. Not many men indeed. The remainder of the day passed in a flurry of cleaning and cooking. By the time the grandfather clock in the parlor struck 6, Fiona had prepared a modest but respectable meal of beef stew, cornbread, an apple pie made from the last of the previous fall's preserved fruit. She had also scrubbed the house from top to bottom, changed into her second-best dress, a simple lavender cotton with white lace at the collar, and pinned her auburn hair into a neat bun at the nape of her neck. Precisely at 6:30, a knock sounded at the door. Fiona smoothed her hands over her skirt, took a steadying breath, and went to answer it. Marshal O'Connor stood on her porch, hat in hand. He'd clearly made an effort for the occasion. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved save for his trim beard, and he wore a clean white shirt under a dark vest. The gun belt remained, she noted, though he'd left his badge behind. "Good evening, Miss Parker," he said, his deep voice sending an unexpected flutter through her chest. "Good evening, Marshal. Please come in." She stepped aside to let him enter. If he noticed the signs of the houses declined, the faded wallpaper, the empty spaces where valuable items had been sold, he gave no indication. Instead, his eyes took in the modest table set for two with the family's remaining good china. "Something smells mighty fine," he commented, following her to the dining room. "Just a simple stew," she replied, suddenly self-conscious about the humble offering. "Please have a seat." As they ate, conversation came more easily than Fiona had anticipated. The Marshal asked polite questions about Westcliffe and her knowledge of its inhabitants, explaining that it helped him to get a sense of the community he was now responsible for protecting. In turn, she learned that he hailed originally from Texas, had been a marshal for 5 years, and before that had worked as a ranch hand and occasionally a bounty hunter. "You said my father saved your life 7 years ago," Fiona said when there was a lull in the conversation. "I've been racking my brain, but I can't recall him mentioning you." The Marshal set down his fork and regarded her thoughtfully. "I expect he wouldn't have. It wasn't a particularly pleasant episode." He hesitated, then continued. "I was tracking a gang of outlaws who'd robbed a bank in Denver. Followed them into the mountains, but they ambushed me, shot my horse out from under me, and left me for dead with a bullet in my side." Fiona leaned forward, captivated by his story. "Your father was prospecting in that area, found me half dead in a ravine. He carried me to his camp, dug the bullet out, and nursed me back to health over the course of a month." Brody's eyes took on a faraway look. "Never asked for anything in return, said helping was just the decent thing to do." "That sounds like my father," Fiona said softly. "When I was well enough to travel, he helped me get back to civilization. By then, the trail on those outlaws was cold." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "He talked about you, though, proud as could be of his daughter back east at that finishing school in Boston. Said you were as smart as your mother and twice as stubborn." Tears pricked at Fiona's eyes. "That was his last good year before the investments went bad. He had to bring me home not long after that when he couldn't afford the tuition anymore." Brody nodded sympathetically. "I'm sorry to hear that. He was a good man." "He was," she agreed, "though not particularly good with money, as it turned out." She glanced around the dining room at the empty spaces where paintings and silver pieces had once stood. "I've sold almost everything of value to keep the creditors at bay, but it wasn't enough. Not with the interest Styles kept adding." A muscle tightened in Brody's jaw at the mention of the banker. "I've heard stories about Styles since I arrived. Seems he has a habit of adjusting interest rates to suit himself." "He offered an alternative to the auction," Fiona said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Said he'd forgive the debt if I would become his mistress." The Marshal's expression darkened dangerously. "Did he now?" "I refused, of course." She straightened her shoulders. "I'd rather be sold to a stranger than give myself willingly to such a man. You're a woman of principle, Miss Parker, like your father." Brody's intense gaze made her cheeks warm. I admire that. They finished the meal with lighter conversation, and afterward, Fiona served coffee in the parlor. As the evening drew to a close, Brody finally addressed the question that had been hanging unspoken between them. I imagine you're wondering what happens now, he said, setting his empty cup aside. Fiona nodded. The house is secure, thanks to you, but I still need to find a way to support myself. The few sewing jobs she'd managed to secure from sympathetic townswomen wouldn't be enough to sustain her for long. I may have a solution if you're amenable. Brody shifted slightly in his chair. The marshal's office needs someone to keep records, handle correspondence, and generally maintain order in the place. It's not glamorous work, but it pays a fair wage. Fiona blinked in surprise. You're offering me a job? I am. $8 a week. Hours would be from 9 until 4, Monday through Saturday. His expression remained serious. I should warn you, though some folks might talk. A single woman working for a single man. People will always talk, Fiona said with sudden determination. But I need the work, and I'd rather earn my way than accept charity. It's not charity, he assured her quickly. The office is a disaster. The previous marshal wasn't much for paperwork. I need someone who can read, write, and keep things organized. Then I accept, she said, extending her hand in a businesslike manner. After a moment's hesitation, Brody took it. His large, calloused hand engulfed her smaller one, and the contact sent an unexpected warmth up her arm. Monday morning, then, he said, releasing her hand perhaps a bit too quickly. 9 o'clock. As he rose to leave, Fiona walked him to the door. Marshal O'Connor, she said, gathering her courage, I want to thank you again, not just for paying my father's debts, but for... She hesitated, struggling to articulate the depth of her gratitude. For giving me my freedom and my dignity. In the dim light of the entryway, something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight parting of his lips. For a breathless moment, Fiona thought he might say something more personal, but instead he merely nodded. Good night, Miss Parker. Good night, Marshal. Fiona closed the door behind him, pressing her back against it as she had the day before. But this time, instead of tears, she found herself smiling. Monday morning dawned clear and cool. Fiona, dressed carefully in a practical brown skirt and white blouse, pinned her hair back simply, and made her way to the marshal's office on Main Street. She arrived 5 minutes before 9 to find Brody already at his desk, surrounded by stacks of wanted posters, telegrams, and various official-looking documents. He looked up when the bell above the door jingled, and for an instant, something like relief flashed across his features. Miss Parker. Good morning. Good morning, Marshal. She glanced around the cluttered office, taking in the dusty filing cabinets, the overflowing desk, and the cobwebs in the corners. I see you weren't exaggerating about the state of things. A wry smile tugged at his mouth. If anything, I understated it. I haven't even looked in those cabinets yet. I'm afraid of what I might find. Fiona hung her shawl on a hook by the door and rolled up her metaphorical sleeves. Well then, I'd better get started. The work was indeed overwhelming at first. Years of records had been haphazardly filed, if filed at all. Wanted posters dating back to before the war were mixed in with current ones. Correspondence had piled up, some of it urgently requiring responses. But Fiona attacked the chaos methodically, starting with the most recent documents and working backward. As the days passed, she and Brody developed a comfortable rhythm. He spent his mornings in the office, reviewing her organized files and dictating responses to various official inquiries, then made his rounds of the town in the afternoons while she continued to restore order to the decades of neglect. The townspeople raised eyebrows at first. Rumors circulated, of course some suggesting that the Marshal had claimed more than just her debts at the auction, others hinting that she was spying for him, reporting on the activities of certain prominent citizens. But as weeks went by and nothing scandalous emerged, most people accepted the arrangement as a practical solution for both parties. Fiona found herself looking forward to the quiet mornings in the office. Brody was not a man of many words, but the ones he chose were thoughtful and often unexpectedly kind. She learned to read his moods, the slight furrow between his brows when a telegram brought unwelcome news, the almost imperceptible relaxation of his shoulders when he was pleased with something. For his part, Brody seemed increasingly comfortable in her presence. He began to share more about his work, sometimes asking for her opinion on local matters. By the end of her first month, they had settled into a partnership of sorts, with Fiona becoming an unofficial advisor on the personalities and politics of Westcliffe. It was on a particularly warm afternoon in late May when Vernon Styles decided to pay a visit to the Marshal's office. Fiona was alone, Brody having left to investigate reports of cattle rustling at a ranch outside town. The banker's corpulent figure filled the doorway, his expensive suit and gold watch chain a stark reminder of the wealth he'd accumulated at the expense of struggling families like hers. "Well, well," he said, removing his bowler hat to reveal thinning gray hair plastered to his scalp. "If it isn't Miss Parker playing at being a secretary." Fiona straightened her spine. "Good afternoon, Mr. Styles. The Marshal is out at present. Is there something I can help you with?" Styles sauntered further into the office, his small eyes taking in the newly organized space. "I must say, when I heard our new lawman had taken you under his protection, I was skeptical, but you seem to have found your place." His tone made the statement sound like an insult. "I'm employed by the Marshal's office, Mr. Styles. Nothing more, nothing less." She kept her voice neutral despite the anger simmering beneath her composed exterior. The banker chuckled, a wheezy sound that set her teeth on edge. Of course. Though I wonder what services you're providing beyond filing papers." He leaned forward, resting his pudgy hands on her desk. "I offered you a similar arrangement, as I recall, though with better compensation than a paltry clerk's wage." Fiona felt her cheeks burn with indignation. "If you have official business with the Marshal, I'd be happy to take a message. Otherwise, I have work to complete." "You've developed quite a sharp tongue since our last conversation," Styles observed, his smile fading. "I wonder if your employer knows about the little arrangement you nearly accepted, before you decided auction was preferable to a private agreement." "That's enough, Styles." Fiona hadn't heard the door open, but Brody now stood just inside the entrance, his expression thunderous. Dust from the trail still clung to his clothes, and his right hand rested casually near his holstered revolver. The banker straightened immediately, his demeanor shifting to one of oily civility. "Marshal O'Connor, I was just having a pleasant chat with your clerk." "Didn't sound pleasant from where I was standing." Brody moved further into the room, positioning himself subtly between Fiona and the banker. "State your business or leave." Styles cleared his throat nervously. "Actually, I came to discuss the matter of the Wilkins property. As you may know, I hold the mortgage, and they've fallen behind on payments." "The Wilkins," Brody's voice sharpened. "That'd be the widow with 3 young children whose husband died in that mine collapse last month." "Tragic circumstances, to be sure," Styles said smoothly, "but business is business. I'll be forced to foreclose next week unless arrangements are made." Brody's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Wilkins is entitled to death benefits from the mining company. I received confirmation just yesterday that the payment is being processed." "Indeed." Styles appeared momentarily discomfited. "Well, Until that payment arrives, the debt remains. You'll give her 30 days, Brody said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. I'll personally ensure the mining company expedites their payment. The banker hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he nodded stiffly. 30 days, then, as a courtesy to you, Marshal. He replaced his hat and moved toward the door, pausing to add, Miss Parker, always a pleasure. When the door closed behind him, Fiona released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Thank you, she said quietly. He was unpleasant. What did he mean about an arrangement you nearly accepted? Brody asked, his blue eyes searching her face. Fiona looked down at her hands. Nothing I'm proud of considering. He offered to forgive the debt if I would. She couldn't bring herself to say it. Become his mistress. Brody finished for her, his voice tight with controlled anger. She nodded, unable to meet his gaze. And he thinks you almost agreed to this. I was desperate, Fiona admitted, shame coloring her voice. My father had been dead for months. The bank was threatening to take the house. I had sold everything of value. For a moment, just a moment, I considered it. She finally looked up at him, needing him to understand. But I couldn't. Even facing the auction block, I couldn't willingly give myself to such a man. Brody's expression softened. You have nothing to be ashamed of, Fiona. The fact that you refused despite your circumstances speaks to your character. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice made her heart skip a beat. Still, he continued, Styles clearly harbors resentment toward you. I don't like the way he looks at you or the way he spoke to you. He hesitated, then added, Perhaps it would be best if you weren't alone in the office for a while. I can handle Vernon Styles, Fiona assured him, though in truth, the banker's visit had unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Brody's expression suggested he wasn't convinced, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair, leaving it appealingly mussed. I need to write up my report on those rustlers. Looks like they've moved on from the area, but I want to alert the marshal in Cannon City to keep an eye out. Just like that, they returned to their professional roles, but something had shifted between them. Fiona felt it in the way his gaze lingered on her a moment longer than necessary, in the way he now positioned his desk so he could see her as they worked. And she was aware of a new warmth in her chest whenever he entered the room, a quickening of her pulse when their hands accidentally brushed as they exchanged documents. June brought scorching heat to Westcliffe, along with news that a notorious outlaw named Jesse Blackburn had been spotted in the region. Brody grew more preoccupied, spending longer hours in the saddle and returning to the office with deepening lines of worry etched around his eyes. Blackburn's dangerous, he explained one evening as they worked late, poring over reports of sightings. I've been tracking him on and off for 3 years. He's wanted for robbery and murder in 4 states, and he has a particular hatred for lawmen. Is that why you became a marshal? Fiona asked. To bring men like him to justice? Brody leaned back in his chair, his expression distant. Partly. My father was a Texas Ranger. He was killed by outlaws when I was 15. I always figured I'd follow in his footsteps, but after what happened to him. He shook his head. My mother made me promise to find a safer occupation. I tried ranching for a while, but it never felt right. So what changed your mind? A shadow crossed his face. Blackburn and his gang raided a small town on the Texas-New Mexico border 5 years ago. They robbed the bank, then set fire to the general store for sport. My mother was inside. His voice remained steady, but his knuckles whitened where he gripped the arms of his chair. She didn't make it out. Fiona's hand flew to her mouth. Oh, Brody, I'm so sorry. After that, I took up bounty hunting, tracked down 2 of his gang members and brought them in. That's when the Marshal's service recruited me. His blue eyes met hers. "Blackburn's the last one, the last piece of unfinished business." "Is that why you requested this posting?" "Because he's been seen in this area," Brody nodded. "I didn't expect to find you here, though." Something in his tone made her heart flutter. "Didn't expect to find myself buying a lady's freedom at auction, either." "Life has a way of surprising us," Fiona said softly. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken words. Brody leaned forward slightly, and for one breathless moment, Fiona thought he might reach for her hand. But the distant sound of shouting from the direction of the saloon broke the spell. "I'd better check that out," Brody said, rising reluctantly. "Miners and cowboys mixing never ends well." "Of course," she replied, trying to hide her disappointment. "Will you walk me home afterward? It's getting late." "I wouldn't have it any other way." The incident at the saloon turned out to be nothing more serious than a disagreement over a card game, quickly settled when the combatants spotted the marshal's badge. Afterward, true to his word, Brody escorted Fiona home through the quiet streets of Westcliffe. "Will you join me for supper on Sunday?" she asked as they reached her porch. "I've been experimenting with my mother's old recipes. I think I've finally mastered her apple dumplings." The smile that lit Brody's face transformed his usually solemn features. "I'd like that very much." Sunday couldn't come soon enough for Fiona. She spent Saturday preparing, scrubbing the house from top to bottom and baking bread. The small kitchen garden that she had started rehabilitating after the auction provided fresh herbs and early summer vegetables. With her first month's wages, she had been able to purchase a small roast, which now sat marinating in a mixture of her mother's secret spices. She was just setting the table when a firm knock sounded at the door. Smoothing her best dress, a pale blue cotton that brought out the green of her eyes, she went to answer it. Brody stood on the porch, looking uncharacteristically nervous. He dressed for the occasion in a crisp white shirt, dark vest, and polished boots. His hair was freshly trimmed, his beard neatly groomed. But it was what he held in his hands that made Fiona catch her breath, a bouquet of wildflowers, their colors vibrant against the muted tones of his clothing. "These reminded me of you," he said, offering them somewhat awkwardly. "Bright and resilient, growing where you might not expect to find beauty." Fiona's cheeks warmed at the unexpected poetry from this usually taciturn man. "They're lovely," she said, taking the flowers and bringing them to her nose. "Please, come in while I put them in water." As she arranged the wildflowers in her mother's crystal vase, one of the few valuable items she hadn't been able to bring herself to sell, Fiona was acutely aware of Brody's presence in her small dining room. He seemed too large for the delicate chairs, too vibrant and alive against the faded wallpaper. They spoke of inconsequential things as they ate: the weather, the progress of her garden, the upcoming Independence Day celebration the town was planning. But beneath the ordinary conversation ran an undercurrent of tension, a sense of words waiting to be spoken. Finally, as they lingered over coffee and the promised apple dumplings, Brody set down his spoon and fixed her with a serious gaze. "Fiona, there's something I need to tell you." The gravity in his tone made her heart skip a beat. "What is it?" "I received a telegram yesterday. Blackburn was spotted near Cannon City heading this way." He took a deep breath. "I'll be riding out tomorrow to intercept him before he reaches Westcliffe." "Alone?" Alarm sharpened her voice. "Brody, you said yourself how dangerous he is." "I've sent for backup, but they won't arrive for at least 3 days. If I wait, Blackburn could disappear again." Determination hardened his features. "This might be my only chance to bring him to justice. Or it might be his chance to add another lawman to his list of victims." Fiona's hands trembled as she set down her cup. "Surely your life is worth more than revenge." "This isn't about revenge," Brody insisted. though the tightness around his eyes suggested otherwise. "It's about doing my job. Protecting innocent people from a killer. And who will protect you?" The question escaped before she could stop it, laden with more emotion than she'd intended to reveal. Something shifted in Brody's expression, surprise, followed by a warmth that reached his eyes. "Fiona," he said softly, "are you worried about me?" "Of course I am," she admitted, unable to dissemble. "You've become important to me." Brody reached across the table and took her hand in his. "You've become important to me too, more than I expected, more than I probably have a right to." His touch sent a current of warmth up her arm. "Then please don't do this, at least wait for your backup." He was silent for a long moment, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. "I can't," he finally said, "but I can promise you this: I'll be careful, I'll come back." Lawmen shouldn't make promises they can't keep. Fiona tried to smile, but her lips trembled. "This one I intend to keep." He squeezed her hand gently. "I have something worth coming back for now." The air between them seemed to vibrate with possibility. Brody's gaze dropped to her lips, and Fiona found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn by an invisible force. But before the moment could culminate, the distant church bells rang out the hour, breaking the spell. Brody released her hand reluctantly. "I should go. I need to prepare for tomorrow." "Of course," Fiona said, rising with him. "What time will you leave, Dawn? I want to cover as much ground as possible before the heat of the day." She nodded, already dreading the morning. As she walked him to the door, an idea struck her. "Wait here," she said, hurrying to her father's study. When she returned, she carried a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. "My father always carried this," she explained, unwrapping it to reveal a small silver compass, its case engraved with a mountain scene. "It guided him home from his prospecting trips. Maybe it can do the same for you." Brody took the compass reverently, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. "Fiona, I can't take this. It's a family heirloom. Please," she insisted. "I want you to have it, for luck." After a moment's hesitation, he slipped it into his vest pocket. "Thank you, I'll treasure it." He paused, seeming to wrestle with himself, then added, "There's something I want to say before I go." Fiona's heart hammered in her chest. "Yes." Brody took a deep breath. "I know it hasn't been long, and I know my timing is terrible, but I need you to know." He ran a hand through his hair in a gesture she'd come to find endearing. "These past weeks, working with you, getting to know you, they've meant more to me than I can say. You're the most courageous, principled woman I've ever met." "Brody," she whispered, her voice catching on his name. "What I'm trying to say," poorly, he continued, "is that I've developed feelings for you, strong feelings. And if you don't feel the same way, I understand completely. But I couldn't ride out tomorrow without telling you." Joy bloomed in Fiona's chest, so intense it was almost painful. "I feel the same way," she admitted. "I've been trying not to because I didn't think you would ever see me as anything more than." The rest of her sentence was lost as Brody closed the distance between them and captured her lips with his. The kiss was gentle at first, questioning, but when Fiona responded by wrapping her arms around his neck, it deepened into something more urgent. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, and for a blissful eternity, the world beyond the two of them ceased to exist. When they finally parted, both breathless, Brody rested his forehead against hers. "Now I definitely have something worth coming back for," he murmured. "You'd better," she replied, her voice unsteady with emotion, "because we have a lot more to talk about when you return." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. "When I return," he promised. With a final kiss, gentle and sweet, he reluctantly stepped back. "Dawn," he reminded her. "I'll stop by the office on my way out." Sleep eluded Fiona that night. Her lips still tingled from Brody's kisses, her mind replaying his words over and over. But alongside the joy ran a current of fear. Blackburn was dangerous, a killer who specifically targeted lawmen, and Brody was riding out alone to confront him. She rose before the first hint of dawn colored the eastern sky, dressed quickly, and made her way through the sleeping town to the marshal's office. A light already burned inside, and when she entered, she found Brody checking his revolver, a rifle propped against the desk beside him. He looked up at her entrance, surprise giving way to a smile that transformed his serious face. "I didn't expect to see you this early. I couldn't let you leave without saying goodbye," she admitted, crossing to him. Brody holstered his revolver and took her hands in his. "I'm glad you came. I made you something." She released his hands to retrieve a small package from her pocket. "It's not much, just some biscuits and jerky for the trail." Gratitude warmed his eyes as he accepted the package. "Thank you." He tucked it into his saddlebag, then turned back to her, his expression growing serious. "Fiona, about yesterday, what I said, what happened between us. You're not having second thoughts, are you?" A sudden fear gripped her. "No," he assured her quickly. "God, no. If anything, I'm more certain than ever." He took her hands again, his grip firm and warm. "But I need to know that you're sure. Your life has been upended these past months. What you feel for me might just be gratitude." Or Fiona silenced him by rising on her tiptoes to press her lips to his. When she drew back, she met his gaze steadily. "What I feel for you has nothing to do with gratitude, Brody O'Connor. It has everything to do with the man you are, honorable, kind, and far too stubborn for your own good." A low chuckle rumbled in his chest. "Stubborn, am I? Riding out alone to confront a notorious killer? Yes, I'd call that stubborn." Her attempt at a light tone failed as worry crept back in. Brody's smile faded. "I have to do this, Fiona." "I know," she sighed. "Just come back to me. Wild horses couldn't keep me away." He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her deeply, as if storing up the memory for the days ahead. When they parted, he checked his pocket watch. "I need to go while the trail is fresh." He gathered his rifle and saddlebags. "I've asked Deputy Miller to keep an eye on things here, and on you." "I'll be fine," she assured him. "It's you I'm worried about." Outside, Brody's chestnut gelding waited patiently, already saddled and ready for the journey. As he secured his gear, the eastern sky began to lighten, painting the mountains with the first golden rays of dawn. "3 days," he said, mounting up. "4 at the most. If I haven't returned by then, the federal marshals I telegraphed should arrive." Fiona nodded, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "I'll keep everything in order until you return." Brody looked down at her, his blue eyes memorizing her face. "Fiona Parker, you are the finest woman I've ever known." "And you, Brody O'Connor, are the most infuriating man," she replied, blinking back tears. "Now go catch your outlaw so you can come back to me." With a tip of his hat and a last lingering look, Brody turned his horse and rode out of Westcliffe, the rising sun at his back. The next 3 days were the longest of Fiona's life. She threw herself into her work at the office, keeping meticulous records and handling the routine matters that fell within her authority. Deputy Miller, a good-natured young man barely out of his teens, stopped by regularly to check on her and report any disturbances in town. On the morning of the 4th day, Fiona arrived at the office to find a telegram waiting. Her hands trembled as she opened it, fearing the worst. "Blackburn spotted near Silvercliff, stop proceeding with caution, stop backup, delayed stop." O'Connor relief washed over her. Brody was alive, at least as of yesterday when the telegram was sent. Silvercliff was a small mining settlement about 15 miles northeast of Westcliffe. If he had found Blackburn's trail there, it might lead him even further from town. The day crawled by, each tick of the clock seeming to take an eternity. By closing time, there had been no further word, and Fiona reluctantly locked up the office and headed home. Sleep eluded her once again, her mind filled with images of Brody lying wounded on some lonely mountain trail, or worse, facing Blackburn's gun without backup. Dawn of the 5th day found her back at the office. Dark circles beneath her eyes, but determination in every line of her body. She would not give in to despair. Brody had promised to return, and she would hold him to that promise. Mid-morning brought an unexpected visitor, Vernon Stiles, his usual smug expression replaced by one of anxious concern. "Miss Parker," he began without preamble, "there's a rumor circulating that Marshal O'Connor has gone after Jesse Blackburn alone. Is this true?" Fiona regarded him warily. "The Marshal is pursuing a wanted criminal, yes. Why do you ask?" Stiles removed his hat, twisting it nervously in his hands. "Because Blackburn was seen in town last night, at my bank." Fiona's blood ran cold. "What?" he broke in after hours. "My night watchman surprised him and—" Stiles swallowed hard. "And Blackburn shot him. Poor Jenkins is at Doc Wilson's now, not expected to make it." "Why would Blackburn target your bank?" Fiona's mind raced. "If he was spotted near Silvercliff." "A diversion, perhaps," Stiles suggested, his voice strained. To draw the Marshal away from town, a terrible suspicion formed in Fiona's mind. "Mr. Stiles, did anything specific get taken from the bank?" "That's just it," the banker replied, genuinely perplexed. "The safe wasn't even touched. Jenkins said Blackburn was going through the file drawers when he interrupted him." File drawers, where mortgage documents would be kept, where evidence of Stiles' questionable lending practices might be found. "I need to find Deputy Miller," Fiona said, rising abruptly, "and then I need to send a telegram." "But what about protection for the bank?" Stiles protested. "Blackburn could return." "I doubt that very much," Fiona replied grimly. "If I'm right, Blackburn got exactly what he came for." It took Fiona the better part of an hour to locate Deputy Miller, who had been helping the blacksmith with a stubborn horse. Together, they crafted a telegram to Brody, informing him of the break-in and Fiona's suspicion that Blackburn had never left the area. "You really think the Marshal was deliberately led away from town?" Miller asked as they left the telegraph office. "I do," Fiona confirmed. "The question is why?" And what was Blackburn looking for in Stiles' files? They had just reached the Marshal's office when the sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider was approaching at a gallop, raising a cloud of dust in his wake. As he drew nearer, Fiona's heart leapt. It was Brody, his hat missing, his clothes dusty from hard riding but gloriously, wonderfully alive. He reined in his lathered horse sharply, dismounting before the animal had fully stopped. "Fiona, thank God, Brody." She rushed to him, propriety forgotten as he enfolded her in his arms. "You're back. Got your telegram an hour ago." His voice was rough with fatigue and emotion. "Rode back as fast as I could." He held her at arm's length, eyes scanning her face. "Are you all right? Has anything else happened?" "I'm fine," she assured him. "But Jenkins, the bank's night watchman, was shot. He's at the doctor's in bad shape." Brody's expression darkened. "I need to see him. He might be able to identify Blackburn." He turned to the young deputy. "Miller, get over to the bank. Make sure it's secure. I'll join you after I check on Jenkins." As Miller hurried off, Brody took Fiona's hand, his grip almost painfully tight. "I've been played for a fool. The Blackburn sightings near Cannon City and Silvercliff were false leads. All this time he was working his way toward Westcliffe." "But why?" Fiona asked as they hurried toward Dr. Wilson's house. "What's so important about Stiles' bank?" "I don't know," Brody admitted, "but I intend to find out." Dr. Wilson met them at the door, his expression grave. "Marshal, I'm afraid Jenkins passed about 20 minutes ago." Loss of blood was too great. Brody's jaw tightened. Did he say anything before he died? Not much, the doctor replied. Just kept muttering about papers and how he knew didn't make much sense, I'm afraid. He knew, Fiona repeated thoughtfully. What if Jenkins recognized Blackburn? What if Blackburn isn't just some random outlaw but someone connected to Westcliffe somehow? Brody's eyes narrowed. That would explain why he targeted Styles' bank specifically. He turned to the doctor. I need to see Styles immediately. You know where he is? Said he was heading home to check on his wife, Dr. Wilson replied. She's been poorly these past few days. As they hurried toward the banker's imposing house on the edge of town, Brody filled Fiona in on his fruitless pursuit. I followed that trail for days. Kept finding signs of campfire here, a horse track there all pointing northeast. But something felt wrong. The signs were too obvious, like they were left deliberately. A wild goose chase, Fiona concluded. Exactly, and I fell for it. Self-recrimination colored his voice. Left you and the town unprotected. You couldn't have known, she assured him, squeezing his hand. And I'm perfectly fine. They reached Styles' house, a large two-story structure with ornate trim and manicured gardens. Brody rapped sharply on the front door, but no response came. That's odd, Fiona murmured. Mrs. Styles is bedridden. There should at least be a housekeeper. Brody tried the handle and found the door unlocked. A sense of foreboding settled over them as they entered the silent house. Mrs. Styles, Fiona called. Mr. Styles, is anyone home? No answer came. The parlor was empty, as was the dining room. But when they reached Styles' study at the back of the house, they found signs of a hasty departure, drawers pulled out, papers scattered across the desk, a half-empty glass of whiskey abandoned on a side table. He's running, Brody said, examining the chaos. But why? And where's his wife? A soft moan from upstairs answered part of his question. They found Mrs. Styles in her bedroom, pale and disoriented, but very much alive. Vernon left, she mumbled when Fiona gently questioned her. Said it wasn't safe anymore. Said he had returned. Who had returned, Mrs. Styles? Brody pressed. Who was your husband afraid of? The elderly woman's cloudy eyes widened. His brother, she whispered. Jesse. Fiona and Brody exchanged shocked glances. Jesse Blackburn is Vernon Styles' brother? Fiona asked, incredulous. Mrs. Styles nodded weakly. Vernon changed his name 30 years ago, after what happened in Missouri. Pieces began falling into place in Brody's mind. What happened in Missouri, Mrs. Styles? The bank robbery, she murmured, her strength clearly failing. They were in it together, but Vernon betrayed Jesse, took the money and ran while Jesse went to prison. Her eyelids fluttered. He always said Jesse would find him someday. Where did your husband go, Mrs. Styles? Fiona asked gently. Did he say? But the woman had drifted into unconsciousness, exhausted by the revelation. We need to get her to Dr. Wilson, Fiona said, already arranging the blankets more comfortably around the frail woman. And I need to organize a search for Styles, Brody added grimly. He can't have gotten far, not with only a few hours' head start. They were interrupted by the sound of the front door crashing open downstairs. Brody immediately pushed Fiona behind him, drawing his revolver in one fluid motion. Stay with Mrs. Styles, he whispered, edging toward the bedroom door. Marshal O'Connor. Deputy Miller's voice called up the stairs. You'd better come quick. There's been another shooting. The scene at the livery stable was grim. Vernon Styles lay face down in the dirt, a pool of blood spreading beneath him. The stable boy, a frightened youth of about 16, huddled nearby, shaking uncontrollably. He just rode up and shot him, the boy stammered when Brody questioned him. Mr. Styles was trying to rent a horse and this stranger walked up, said hello, brother, and then he swallowed hard. One shot, Right in the chest. Then he just walked away. Which direction did he go? Brody demanded. The boy pointed toward the outskirts of town. Headed for the old Wilson place, I think. The abandoned homestead up on the ridge. Brody turned to Miller. Get the undertaker for Stiles. And find Doc Wilson. Tell him Mrs. Stiles needs medical attention at their home. His expression hardened. I'm going after Blackburn. Not alone, Fiona insisted, having followed them to the livery. You said yourself it could be a trap. All the more reason for you to stay here, Brody argued. I won't put you in danger. I'm already in danger, she countered. We all are, as long as Blackburn is out there, and I know the old Wilson place better than anyone. I used to play there as a child. Brody hesitated, clearly torn between his duty to pursue the killer and his desire to keep Fiona safe. Besides, she added, you promised to be careful. How can I make sure you keep that promise if I'm not with you? A reluctant smile tugged at his mouth. You're as stubborn as I am. You know that? I believe I mentioned that quality before you rode off the first time, she reminded him with a hint of tartness. In the end, they compromised. Fiona would accompany Brody to the base of the ridge, where she would wait while he approached the abandoned homestead. Deputy Miller would gather a group of trusted townsmen as backup and follow as soon as possible. The ride to the Wilson place took less than half an hour. The abandoned homestead stood starkly against the sky, its weathered boards gray with age, its windows dark empty sockets. From their vantage point below the ridge, they could see a single horse tethered outside. He's definitely here, Brody said, dismounting and helping Fiona down. I want you to stay here with the horses. If you hear gunfire, ride back to town as fast as you can. Fiona gripped his arm. Be careful, please. Brody's expression softened. I have that compass, remember, to guide me home. He touched the pocket where the silver case rested. And I have a very compelling reason to come back safely. He kissed her briefly but firmly, then turned and began making his way up the rocky slope toward the homestead. Fiona watched his progress anxiously, her heart in her throat. The minutes stretched interminably as Brody reached the crest of the ridge and approached the dilapidated building, moving from cover to cover with the caution of a man well versed in tracking dangerous prey. When he disappeared through the homestead's doorway, Fiona held her breath, straining to hear any sound. For long moments, there was nothing but the whisper of the wind through the dry grass and the occasional stamp of the horses' hooves. Then a gunshot shattered the silence. Fiona's heart stopped. One shot, just like the one that had killed Stiles. Before she could process what she was doing, her feet were carrying her up the slope, heedless of Brody's instructions to flee. She couldn't leave him, not if there was any chance he was still alive. As she neared the homestead, a second shot rang out, followed by a crash and the sound of breaking glass. Fiona hesitated at the corner of the building, her breathing ragged from the climb and from fear. You're just like all the other lawmen, a harsh voice snarled from within. Think you're so righteous. My brother thought the same before he stole my share and left me to rot in prison. Your brother paid for his crimes, Brody's voice replied, strained but steady, just as you'll pay for yours. Fiona's knees nearly buckled with relief. Brody was alive. But for how long? Peering cautiously around the corner, she could see through a broken window into what had once been the homestead's main room. Brody was on the floor, clutching his left shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. A few feet away, a man who bore an unsettling resemblance to Vernon Stiles stood with his back to the door, a revolver trained on Brody. I spent 28 years planning this, Blackburn said, his voice eerily calm. 28 years imagining the look on Vernon's face when I found him. And it was everything I hoped for. He cocked the hammer of his revolver. Now I'll finish the job by taking down another lawman. Fiona's gaze darted around frantically, searching for some way to help. Her eyes fell on a rusty shovel leaning against the side of the building. Moving as quietly as possible, she grabbed it and crept toward the homestead's door, which stood partially open behind Blackburn. "Your quarrel was with your brother," Brody was saying, clearly trying to buy time. "He's dead. You've had your revenge. Why add a murder charge that will guarantee you hang?" Blackburn laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "You think I plan to be taken alive? No, Marshal. This ends today one way or another." As he raised his gun for the killing shot, Fiona burst through the door and swung the shovel with all her might. The metal blade connected with the back of Blackburn's head with a sickening thud, and he crumpled to the floor, his unfired gun skittering across the rough boards. "Fiona!" Brody struggled to his feet, his face pale with pain and shock. "I told you to stay back." "And I told you to be careful," she retorted, rushing to his side. "So we're even." A groan from Blackburn indicated he wasn't out of the fight yet. Brody lurched toward the outlaw's dropped weapon, scooping it up just as Blackburn rolled over, reaching for a knife in his boot. "Don't," Brody warned, the revolver steady despite his wounded shoulder. "It's over, Blackburn." The outlaw stared up at them, blood trickling from a gash where the shovel had struck him. For a moment it seemed he might still try to fight. Then with a bitter laugh he let his hand fall away from the knife. "Well, well," he said, his gaze shifting to Fiona. "Looks like the Marshal has himself a guardian angel." His eyes narrowed. "You're George Parker's girl, aren't you? I recognize those green eyes." Fiona stiffened in surprise. "You knew my father, knew of him," Blackburn corrected. "Vernon kept tabs on everyone in this town, had quite the file on your father after he started asking questions about some of the mining company's financial dealings." A malicious smile spread across his face. "Convenient accident, wasn't it?" "That cave in that killed him." The blood drained from Fiona's face. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying my brother didn't just cheat his customers," Blackburn replied, clearly relishing the pain his words caused. "He eliminated problems, permanently." Brody's expression hardened. "You're trying to say Styles had something to do with George Parker's death. That's why you were looking through his files at the bank for proof." "Smart lawman," Blackburn mocked. "Too bad you'll never find it. Vernon burned those records the minute Jenkins recognized me at the bank." The sound of approaching horses interrupted the confrontation. Deputy Miller and several armed townsmen surrounded the homestead, taking Blackburn into custody and helping Brody back to town, where Dr. Wilson confirmed that the bullet had passed clean through his shoulder without hitting anything vital. "You're a lucky man, Marshal," the doctor said as he finished bandaging the wound. "Another inch to the right, and we'd be having a very different conversation." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Brody replied, his eyes finding Fiona, who hadn't left his side throughout the treatment. "I had my guardian angel watching over me." Later that evening, as Fiona sat by Brody's bedside in the small room above the telegraph office that served as his quarters, they discussed Blackburn's revelations about her father's death. "You believe him?" she asked, her voice small. "About my father's accident being deliberately caused?" Brody took her hand, his touch gentle despite the pain he must still be feeling. "I don't know. Blackburn could have been lying, trying to cause more pain even as he was being captured. But it makes a certain sense," Fiona insisted. "My father was meeting with other mine investors the week before he died. He seemed troubled, said there were discrepancies in the accounts that didn't add up. If Styles was embezzling from the mining company and your father discovered it." Brody nodded slowly. "It's possible. But without those records, we may never know for certain." Fiona sighed, the weight of uncertainty settling heavily on her shoulders. "I've spent 3 years believing it was just an accident, that my father was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Would knowing it was deliberate bring him back? Brody asked gently. Would it change how you remember him? She considered this. No, he'd still be the same courageous, principled man who raised me, who saved a wounded stranger in the mountains without asking for anything in return. The man who taught his daughter to be just as courageous and principled, Brody added, squeezing her hand. The woman who faced an auction block with her head held high and who took down a notorious outlaw with a rusty shovel. A reluctant smile tugged at Fiona's lips. When you put it that way. The past matters, Brody acknowledged, but not as much as the future. He shifted in the bed, wincing slightly at the movement. Speaking of which, there's something I've been wanting to ask you. I had planned a more romantic setting, but recent events have reminded me that life is unpredictable and sometimes short. Fiona's heartbeat quickened. What is it? Brody met her gaze steadily. Fiona Parker, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? I know it's sudden, and I know I don't have much to offer beyond a lawman's salary and a life that sometimes involves getting shot at. Yes, Fiona interrupted, tears of joy springing to her eyes. Yes, Brody O'Connor, I will marry you. Relief and happiness transformed his face. Are you sure? I don't want you to feel obligated because I paid your father's debts. Or, she silenced him with a kiss, gentle but fervent. I'm marrying you because I love you, she said when they parted. Not because you saved me, but because of who you are, honorable, kind, and far too stubborn for your own good. Brody chuckled, then winced as the movement jarred his injured shoulder. We make quite a pair, don't we? Both too stubborn for our own good. Perhaps, Fiona agreed with a smile. But together, I think we make a pretty formidable team. 3 weeks later, on a perfect summer afternoon, Fiona Parker and Brody O'Connor were married in the small church in Westcliffe. The bride wore a simple white dress, adorned with wildflowers, and the groom wore his marshal's badge polished to a high shine. The entire town turned out for the occasion, curious to witness the union of the woman who had once stood on an auction block and the lawman who had purchased her freedom instead of her person. After a brief honeymoon in Denver, they returned to Westcliffe to begin their life together. Brody continued as marshal, with Fiona working alongside him as his clerk and occasional deputy, when the situation warranted. Together, they established a reputation for fair and firm law enforcement that made Westcliffe one of the most peaceful towns in Colorado. Jesse Blackburn was tried and convicted for the murders of Vernon Stiles and Jenkins, the bank watchman. Before he was hanged, he provided a signed confession implicating Stiles in arranging the mine accident that killed George Parker. Though it didn't bring her father back, the confirmation gave Fiona a sense of closure and justice. In the spring of 1877, they welcomed their first child, a son they named George, after Fiona's father. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, followed by twin boys in 1881. The Parker family home, once nearly lost to debt, rang with children's laughter once more. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Brody surprised Fiona with a deed to a small ranch outside of town. I thought it might be time for a change, he explained as they stood on the porch of the modest but well-built house, overlooking fields that stretched to the mountains beyond. The children need room to grow, and I've been thinking about hanging up my badge. Are you sure? Fiona asked, knowing how much his work as a marshal meant to him. You've done so much good in Westcliffe. The town's peaceful now, Brody replied, wrapping an arm around her waist, and I've had my fill of getting shot at. Besides, I missed out on ranching the first time around. I think I'm ready to give it another try. He kissed her temple. With the right partner, of course. Always, Fiona promised, leaning into his embrace. as they watched the sun setting behind the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Fiona reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the humiliation of the auction block to the happiness of their life together, every step, even the painful ones, had led to this place of love and contentment. "What are you thinking about?" Brody asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "About freedom," she replied softly. "How you gave me mine that day at the auction, not knowing that in doing so you were claiming my heart." Brody turned her to face him, his blue eyes as clear and captivating as they had been the first time she'd seen them. "Best investment I ever made," he said with a tender smile. "Though I think I got the better end of the bargain." "We both did," Fiona whispered, rising on her tiptoes to kiss him as the last rays of sunlight gilded their figures against the backdrop of the Colorado wilderness, two souls who had found in each other not just freedom, but a love worth far more than any price that could be paid.